And here is my prediction. Whenever you've seen the history of technological innovation with the arts, the creators always get screwed.
Welcome to Tank Talks, a podcast that brings you insights and stories from some of the best and brightest minds in technology and investing. I'm your host, Matt Cohen, founder and managing partner at Ripple Ventures.
We welcome back to the Tank John Ruffalo to discuss the news and stories making headlines in the tech and venture capital ecosystem.
All right, John, welcome back to the Tank. Lots to cover here. I want to jump right in because there was some big news happening in the Toronto by-elections, the massive upset in the Canadian by-election last week with the St. Paul Toronto district having a huge blow delivered to the Liberal caucus and Trudeau and his team over there of bandits. You know, obviously, this is not something that a lot of people outside of maybe Toronto or Canada would understand. But right now, we have these by-elections that happen, obviously, and that represents what happens in Parliament, hopefully when there's a federal election. So in Toronto, there was a stronghold around this district in sort of center of Toronto called St. Paul for 30 years, standing as a Liberal stronghold. And the Conservative candidate, Don Stewart, won the election with 42.08% of the votes. The first time this has happened to go Conservative since 1993. And so, you know, this election may send a broader signal to the political climate and the voter sentiment that we're seeing here in Canada, given some of the historical dominance of Liberals in these districts. So what are your thoughts around this? And, you know, should MPs be worried about their Liberal caucus strongholds? You know, or is this not really something to make a big deal about?
You know, I would say, generally speaking, by-elections are never really an indication of general moods, but this one was a little bit different. This is a riding that is relatively affluent. It's well educated. But this is a riding that has largely been either NDP or Liberal. And the general, I'm going to average the populace, is generally center or left of center. What was the interesting aspect here, again, this is more anecdotally, is a number of the folks who would have traditionally voted Liberal actually have moved and voted Conservative, much to the, frankly, shock and dismay of everyone. I was expecting it to be close, maybe about a 5% in favor of the Liberal Party and not an actual loss. And I think the Liberals are absolutely stunned. A few of the canvassers who I know personally, I just asked them, like, what was the mood? And there is obviously a general negative sentiment. But there was a couple of themes that actually seemed to be asked a lot. Number one was the issue around support for Jewish folks in the country. I believe this writing had either 11 or 15% of the Jewish population. And there was, a lot of unhappiness around that. And then number two, surprisingly, I guess, for me, was the capital gain question. And again, it's not about the money. These are affluent folks. It was the anti-business or anti-success narrative that we kept on warning about. And if that is a precursor, this negative view might be pervasive right across the country.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, I'm not in this riding, so I did not vote in it, but obviously I have a lot of contemporaries and friends who are part of this district. And the people that I spoke to there who are often fiscally conservative, liberally sort of minded, focused is where they vote usually. They are very, very upset about a lot of the things that you mentioned, in addition to the way that they've attacked professionals like dentists and doctors and healthcare providers in this capital gains budget decision. And that's what drew the line for a lot of people, notwithstanding, obviously, things around the October 7th and the way that this government has responded to it. But I think that is definitely something that we're going to see across the country from people who are, fiscally conservative in mind, but liberally, minded in social discussions are going to actually flip the script here. And I think this is why, a lot of MPs are trying to organize the caucus. And maybe, I don't know if they force Trudeau out to leave. I doubt it. It doesn't seem, I don't think they are. They're very passive when it comes to this type of friction. and trying to undermine, someone who's held office as long as he has. But it's an interesting start to a very long time till we have an election, it feels like. But maybe things will move a little bit faster now. Sticking with the theme of Canada, there was a Globe article this week that talked about Canada's challenge in commercializing AI research. Something you and I know a lot about, even though we're a leader in the field academically. And it talks about why there is, so much contribution to AI development here in Canada. However, we've been unable to translate these into advancements in profitable enterprises. Discussing factors like funding, obviously, and infrastructure and policy, and obviously talent retention being the main drivers of why we've been unable to do this. But it's interesting that this is still coming back around every so often. Yet the strategies that are being recommended to be implemented all still come back to the government.
Yes.
It still feels like this is the responsibility of the government. I wonder why that is the case in your eyes, John.
Well, it's funny, but I actually very recently wrote an op-ed on this very point. Is first and foremost, the solutions have to be private sector driven. And if they're not, we're already digging from a hole. The role of a government should, at a bare minimum, get out of the way. So don't do self-inflicted wounds, like this capital gains tax where you're making that commercialization possibility even harder. But then being selective in where you can actually help, if you can help. So one of the areas that, again, I did have discussions with the government on AI and commercialization in particular, and it was more on the adoption front. Unless you were a very large company, you didn't really have access to the resources. Is there a way for a lot of the companies, whether they're startups or SMEs, to having access to infrastructure resources that just like we do with power or energy? Could we have infrastructure support? And that was introduced, I guess, somewhat in this budget. But the real question is turning on this commercialization. And, the problem that we're still at that infrastructure level of AI, frankly. And, it's clearly becoming, there is no moat on the infrastructure side other than capital. We're not a capital rich country. So we're feeling that we're falling far and further behind. I think the truth of the matter is we were always strong on the application layer. This is where we need to be spending our time and our dollars and not fretting. I do hope we don't get too negative on ourselves, but man, it is feel like we're getting further and further away from, the early lead that we had, 8 or 10 years ago.
I think also there's a mindset of investing in the picks and shovels in the infrastructure layer. When it comes to something you can't physically see or touch is hard probably to wrap your head around. Investing in the 407 ETR or something is something that a lot of government and pension funds could get their head around. But investing in the frontier model building space, when that is considered infrastructure and will be hopefully a commodity infrastructure that people want to use, is hard for people to wrap their heads around. PSP is obviously taken a bet on that, betting on Cohere. But speaking of pension funds, BCI, British Columbia Investment Management Corp, has had a lot of good start to the year. I mean, despite underperforming its benchmark with a 7.5% return compared to an 11.6% gain, their assets are still pretty high, $250 billion. And they've come out saying that they're looking to put more money to work here and take advantage of some of these depressed prices and investing in things like data centers, more infrastructure around the data, industry is what they're focusing on. Do you think that this is how the pension funds can sort of nibble away at shifting gears from real assets into more technological assets?
Yeah. So, in full disclosure, BCI is a very large investor in my fund. So I get to see from the inside. What I love what BCI is doing, and I think this is great when, pension funds in Canada, they have one massive advantage, or really two, I'd say. They have their access to capital, so they could direct their capital into strategies or fund managers that allow them to source the most effective deals. And then the ones that they think that they actually have expertise. You mentioned, data centers. Well, they have a great investment in Quadrille, their real estate arm. So they know that space very well. They love innovation. So they know where they're not strong and where they probably shouldn't be wading into. But in areas where they have a great advantage like that, they really double down. And I think that's a phenomenal strategy, and one that doesn't get you into a whole lot of trouble as well, too, because you gotta manage your pension fund obligations. So I agree. I think they had a great year, and the fund is continuing to perform very well.
It's great to hear that pension funds like BCI are partnering with, industry technology investors like you, as well as thinking about gearing up for investments over the next several years. They're defining it as a very promising period with expansions and operations in New York and London. So it is still great to see pensions like BCI putting money to work and also supporting innovative investors like yourself. Speaking of investors, Thrive Capital is throwing more money at taking down Hollywood with their investment in AI studio AI A24, an independent film studio that secured $250 million, a part of a Thrive Capital round, as well as $75 million for an OpenAI. And they're describing this as sort of incorporating AI into the filmmaking process, but has no immediate plans to integrate it into the production of making films.
Not yet.
Which obviously I don't believe.
Yeah.
Josh Kushner of Thrive is joining the board and is obviously driving AI-focused strategies to move Hollywood to adopting more of these techniques. I think the question right now, obviously, is, do you think this is something that Hollywood is going to be very scared about? We saw the music labels band together and take a shot at suing Suno, the AI music creation tool. So what do you think happens here?
I don't have any insider knowledge, but I just read the developments where Hollywood gets particular. And let's talk about the talent side. Is they're not so opposed to AI. They're opposed to the use of likeness of them and not making any money off of it. Let's talk about Scarlett Johansson, where she wonderfully went after OpenAI, and boy, don't mess with her if you're OpenAI or Disney. But I agreed. Now, where the celebrity or talent might be saying, hey, look, as long as you use my likeness, and if I could replicate myself and not having to, only limit myself to 1 or 2 movies a year, but I could do 10, and it means I get to stay home, and and I'm going to get, maybe not the full cut that I would have had before, but I'll make money easier. I think that they will get on side because it's inevitable that this is going to happen. There's also going to be this issue, I think, too, is that, and you're seeing it in social media, when you see, say, influencers, and you're seeing the human influencers versus the constructed influencers. Once you know something is constructed and it's not a human being, do you follow what that influencer says as much? If the answer is no, then there's going to be 2 pay scales for human versus non-human. But I think the inevitability of having both is clearly there. So my view is it's coming. So figure out how you can both coexist, and I think both win. But this was an interesting investment that's a little bit of a precursor where I think things will ultimately end up.
I mean, John, we've seen this movie before. 20 years ago, we saw the story around Napster and all the music labels that went after them. And then the big lawsuit that Metallica had, when they went to the District Court of California to take them down, and then what happened? Apple swooped in and made it kumbaya around the table while taking their 30% VIG on the downloads. I think we're probably going to see something happen here, right? So the AI lawsuit that was launched last week with major record labels suing companies like Suno as well as Udio were being sued by Universal Music Group, Sony Music, Warner Music, and others, part of the industry association, RIAA. And I think that we're going to see the same thing happen here. And maybe it's Apple again that saves the day, where they bring the two parties together and they create this pay for play kind of contract between the foundation models and the AI tools and the content creators and the celebrities and Hollywood stars. So I don't think this is very different than what we saw over 20 years ago with Napster.
And here is my prediction. Whenever you've seen the history of technological innovation with the arts, the creators always get screwed. And it's actually the distribution channel changes, but they make all of the money. So before, when you had the labels and then Napster tried to come in, which and change that, and then it was Apple. Well, guess what? The creators still got pennies on the dollar, and now the money's gone to Apple. So I agree with you that I think here the democratization by the talent, they always get screwed because it's the folks in the middle that seem to always take their cut. And that's where the innovation really happens.
Yeah, I mean, sticking with Apple here, it feels like Apple is just asking everybody to the dance when it comes to leveraging all of the money that has been spent on these frontier model creation tools like Anthropic and OpenAI and Llama. And they're just going to benefit the most from it. You know, we saw obviously an announcement with OpenAI partnering with Apple at the WWDC. I'm sure that didn't make Microsoft feel too happy about it, giving their rival enemies. But now we see Zuckerberg and Tim Cook getting into bed with each other as well, potentially. And they've always had a huge rivalry. Then you throw Anthropic, which is backed by obviously Amazon. It just feels like Apple is running circles around all of these money dumping machines, and they're going to be the ones that have the network and the walled garden to be able to control and the distribution, right? I mean, we saw the news the other day that OpenAI has even outpaced Microsoft in selling AI models, which is a huge shift in the industry. Microsoft was initially, having the upper hand selling large infrastructure contracts and industry influence around how people can adopt tools like OpenAI. But it looks like OpenAI is teaching Microsoft a little thing or two, where they're outpacing the ability to sell AI models and surpassing what they say is, $2.5 to $3.5 billion run rate business, and outpacing Microsoft Azure's OpenAI service. So what started off as like a friendly marriage is now turning into a bit of a friendly rivalry, it feels like.
And Matt, one wonders whether, Apple in their search for more dollars is going to need it to pay the $38 billion fine from the EU on their infringement from a digital distribution. So we'll see what happens there.
Has anyone added up the total amount of fines that the EU has actually collected versus the headline numbers that come out here? It is unbelievable. I mean, that's how they make their GDP, right?
Yeah, but this is how they do. They'll come and they'll scare the crap out of you, and then the question is, what's going to be the real amount? But give them a little bit of credit that they've been trying to go after U.S. big tech in particular, and they're trying to find every means necessary. So, just like, Al Capone, you could beat everybody until the tax man cometh.
That's a great place to end it, John. Thanks for joining us in the tank today.
All right. Thank you.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Tank Talks. We hope you found today's conversation as insightful as we did. If you're enjoying the show, we've got 3 quick things to ask of you. First, hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcast, or YouTube. Next, follow us and stay up to date on upcoming episodes and behind-the-scenes content on social media with Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And lastly, share the love. If you found value in today's episode, share with a friend or colleague who'd benefit too. Your support helps us bring in more amazing guests and keeps the Tank Talks engine running. That's it for today. Until next time, keep disrupting and innovating.